nerds, what's up? Welcome to my last 3 reviews of SPFBO 9. It has been a really fun year, and I am excited to talk about these last 3 books. So let's talk about The Last Ranger by J.D.L. Rosell. So I really liked The Last Ranger quite a bit, actually. This is definitely a character book, like a character about their emotions and what they're going through, and it's also a political book. And both of those things ended up working pretty well for me. I was really interested in the politics of the book, and I was interested in the main character. Now, I will say, the main character is an unlikable protagonist. Like, that's the point of the novel. The main character is extremely racist. That is part of her plot line. I like an unlikable main character, especially when it follows a few rules, which is, if there's gonna be an unlikable main character, I need the narrative to not try to get me to like them. Like, I sometimes will get frustrated if I'm reading an unlikable character and I feel that the author is nervous for me to dislike the character. And I don't feel that at all in this novel. I think the author is like, yeah, here is my flawed character and this is who she is. And it is not trying to apologize for her. It does explain why she is the way she is, but not in a way that's like, oh, shouldn't you feel sorry and shouldn't you like her? It's just kind of like, no, this is what happened and this is why she is the way she is. And here's the effect on the story. And I feel like it made a story that might feel more like typical fantasy have like an extra interesting element because you are kind of seen through this prejudiced character's eyes and how it's really so frustrating how that's influencing her actions. I also like the world building elements of this novel. It wasn't like super complex, but the idea of the Titans was very interesting. These magical kind of giants that are lifted from the area around them. I also, well, you know what's funny is with the magic in this book, the main character is pretty powerful, pretty magical. And every time I started to get frustrated by how powerful our main character was and started to feel like this magic's OP, immediately the author hit me with the consequence of the magic, which I just loved. It was almost like the author could sense that the reader was going to start being like, oh, this is pretty magical. And then the consequent hit. And one of the consequences actually was not kind of a consequence I was expecting. And I thought it was a really cool consequence actually of magic. And I was really into it. And I really liked that. And I just appreciated that it was a book that had some pretty powerful characters who could do powerful things, but there were natural consequences to what that was. That's always really important to me in a story with high magic. I also think it's really interesting at the end of the book, the author started exploring the ethics of the magic system and what is and isn't ethical, which is something I don't see a whole lot in terms of magic systems, discussing the ethics of using the magic. I hope that's explored more maybe in the next book, but I thought that was an interesting element that I liked was starting to be looked at. Okay, the next thing I'm gonna say could be considered like a mild spoiler. I don't personally feel like it's a spoiler. I feel like the character development is pretty obvious from the beginning, but just a warning if you wanna skip ahead. I personally don't think it will ruin the book, but just wanted to give a warning. Obviously, our main character has to go through a character arc. I knew that from page 1, which is why I don't think this is a spoiler. You knew she was going to have to reckon with this prejudice at some point. I don't necessarily love the aftermath of dealing with that prejudice. I think our character has a change of heart a little too quickly. I think if you were this prejudiced for 2 decades, that it would be something you were working to untangle for probably the rest of your life. Now, in fairness, that might be explored more in the second book. This is a first book of a series. So maybe that does get explored more. Maybe, you know, right after you make a change is when you are the most gung-ho about it. And maybe she'll have to reckon with these complicated emotions later. So I don't want to judge it too harshly. But it did feel like some characters were maybe a little too forgiving in the end. And I wished we had kind of stuck with the hard reality of what would probably happen. So I think it was just like, it ended up being a little bit too soft for me personally with how that was resolved. But overall, I thought The Last Ranger was a super solid read, and I am rating it 8.5. And I guess mini spoiler alert, but this is what I'd consider to be my favorite of all the finalists this year. So I really liked The Last Ranger. I thought it was a really solid book. Okay, next up is The Fall Is All There Is by C.M. Caplan. So this was sci fantasy in my opinion. Definitely a lot of like science fiction elements, very Star Wars-esque in that way, where it like felt very science fiction in the setting, but it obviously had a ton of fantasy elements. So I always think that's a fun thing. I also thought it used a pretty typical setting uniquely. So in this book, it's one of those civilizations that has had a couple of catastrophic events. So they kind of had to reset, a la Wheel of Time. And a lot of fantasies do that, right? Where like they used to have this great age and then something happens and they fall. This one was interesting because it kept the modern setting. Like this is still very modern. It has very modern words. It has very modern items. And they still kind of experience that. And so I thought that was such an interesting setting because usually we reset to like Middle Ages. And that is not what this book did. So that was really unique to me. And I enjoyed that aspect. The magic and kind of like sci-fi elements in this book are really bizarre. And I mean that positively. They're kind of gross too. And it just like, I haven't really read anything like it before. And I'm always kind of interested when someone does something new with the world. So it was just mostly the horses. They have these like half biological, half tech horses that were just kind of gross, but very fascinating. So if you like kind of unique blended fantasy and sci-fi elements, I think you would really enjoy that part of this novel. I think this book had good characterization. I knew who all the characters were. I felt like they had very strong senses of self, like personality traits. I also just found the sibling dynamics to be super great in the novel for the most part. There were some moments that I feel like it didn't work for me, but for the most part, I felt like it really captured like a chaotic sibling energy of like having a really tough growing up, having so much love for your siblings, but also having to deal with kind of these difficult elements of like, hey, we weren't always the best to each other. Maybe there was abuse involved, but and dealing with both sides of those I thought was really interesting. And what I thought was particularly interesting is when I read about the author that he is a quadruplet and he wrote about a quadruplet in here. So obviously some of it must have come from personal experience and maybe that's why it felt so real. Also, this book features a neurodivergent character. He self-labels as autistic in the novel. Now, take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. I am neurotypical, so again, grain of salt. But I do see like in a lot of books that use neurodivergent characters, I see a common complaint being like it's too exaggerated. It's too over the top. The whole book is about it and it doesn't ring true. There's like a false feeling about some of those characters. And I've recognized that in books that I've read. This one I felt just did such a good job of making the autism an aspect of the main character, but not the whole character. Yes, that obviously influences how this main character sees the world. It influences how he interacts. It influences things with his family, his past, his history. It is there, but it is not the only thing defining their character. It is just an element, which I think was great and something I really enjoyed. And I feel like if you're someone who is looking for neurodivergent characters, I feel like it was done well. Again, grain of salt, just kind of how I saw it. So my complaints for this book is that it was just really chaotic. It was a really chaotic book, and I think some of the chaos wasn't necessary. I think some of it was very purposeful, so I'm not like, I understand, but it was just a lot for me sometimes. It also had a similar problem that I said about The Sunlit Man, even though they're very different books. But it's like too fast-paced, too many events are happening. Like you just can never catch a narrative breath. You're just like being forced from one thing to the other, and it's like so fast-paced, which I'm sure some people love. But because I thought this author was particularly decent at writing characters, I wish we had just had like a few more slow moments to really kind of sit with the characters and the character relations without being like whisked off to another chaotic plot. There was also definitely moments, even though I thought the character development was strong, there were definitely some moments where I just wish we had seen a little bit more development of the relationships between the siblings, especially because we don't really know much of their history. I feel like I wish a little bit more was revealed. Overall, I thought The Fall Is All There Is was a pretty solid read, and I am giving it a 7.5. Okay, last up, Master of the Void by Wend Raven. So this is a YA kind of coming of age novel, which already is going to be just a little tough for me. You guys know I rarely read YA anymore, and this definitely had a lot of the typical tropes and character beats you would see in a YA, which I think is positive if you are writing a YA novel. Like, I think this has a lot of elements that people are going to really enjoy because of those novels. You have, a really strong group of friendship and sibling characters, and you have some really interesting magic and characters that are wielding this magic and a whole world building and system. And you also have like coming of age tropes and romance coming of age tropes and miscommunication tropes, things that are very common, and I think work well in a YA, things that I'm just not really loving reading anymore. So already that was like a little tough for me. But I think the biggest problem I had in this book kind of boils down to mostly the same issues. This is a very ambitious book. It is trying to do a lot, and it has a lot of characters and thus a lot of POVs. And I feel like this book got a little bogged down in its POV use. For example, there were a lot of POVs in this book that you only ever saw once for like 4 paragraphs. And it would kind of just jump around to different people. I understand why. I think there was a lot of emotions and thoughts that the author wanted to get across. I think sometimes you need to resist the temptation to tell your readers everything you know about your world. Sometimes I think that stuff has to stay hidden. And I think there are times here where I didn't need to know all of that and in favor of getting rid of some of those unnecessary POVs. I almost could say, like, I wish this book was primarily our main 3 POVs, which would be Ormond, Darius, and, Nightshade. I hope that's right. The main villain character. Those 3 with maybe some backup from Ember and Sorrel. But instead, we pretty much get to hear from everybody. And it just became too much. And I think another element factored into that is because most of the characters sounded exactly the same within their heads. So the perspective of the 12-year-old girl sounded the same as the perspective of the 18-year-old boy, sounded the same as the perspective of the 35-year-old man. They all sounded so similar. And so when you have these multiple POVs and all the characters sound the same, that bogged down the book for me personally. It was tough for me to kind of feel any emotion towards the characters because they didn't necessarily have a strong enough characterization for me. Wrapped into that, some pretty upsetting things would happen to our characters, and I never quite felt like the characters responded in a natural way. We often just moved on too quickly. And I obviously can't talk about them because they're big events in the novel, but one I think I can say kind of high level enough is there was like a mass attack, and one of the characters is like flirting with another character right as they find this out. And I know that character often used jokes in hard situations. Like, he was probably the one with the most character, but even still in that moment, it just felt like callous in a way that didn't feel like how people would maybe normally respond. And that happened a lot. And as someone who really is a character reader, it's hard for me to read a novel with that many characters and feel like maybe they're not acting in ways that make sense. And also, I can't really tell a difference between a lot of the characters. So ultimately, this one wasn't as successful for me. Once again, I don't necessarily think I'm the audience for this novel. I think a lot of people would really love being in that many people's heads for a YA, and those kind of character things wouldn't really bother them. They'd be so taken away by the magic and the world and the high stakes. But for me, it just didn't quite work. So I am rating Master of the Void a 5. Okay, and that concludes my SPFBO 9 year. It was another great year. It was so fun. Please tell me in the comments which of the finalists you've read, which ones you've liked, or which, if any, you're going to pick up. Let me know. And as always, make sure you support self-published authors. And if you like these kind of videos, like and subscribe. That's the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.